often we see for people who have histamine intolerance or mast cell activation syndrome, you just go, oh, like this is all histamine, all of these symptoms.
What do you think is most important for that person to understand to smooth out their health journey a little bit and sooner rather than later get to the better health that they're seeking?
Aside from diet, probably the most important thing you can do is...
Tracey, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I am very, very excited to follow. I know you had Luca on. She's a colleague of mine. So yeah, very excited to follow her. And I know she already provided a wealth of information. So I'll see what I can add to the conversation.
No, there's no pressure. Yeah, you and Luca are definitely a dynamic duo and put out a lot of great content and information and are helping a lot of people. So likewise, we are very excited to have you on and hear your side as well. And Luca's episode, the topic of histamine intolerance, was really well received, really popular. A lot of people comment or write in about it. And we're doing more and more episodes about it because I think it's a really nice kind of example of what people deal with with chronic health issues today, which is a huge spectrum of symptoms. Everyone's got their own little cluster, but it often doesn't match anything perfectly. They go to a lot of different, experts, maybe doctors, specialists, and get confusing answers or maybe help a little, but not all the way. And then over time, it feels like maybe no progress is being made. People get frustrated. They feel really confused. So we're excited to have you on here today, and we'll dive into all that. To start, can you just give us a little background? Why is this histamine intolerance, this kind of immune dysfunction, why is it so confusing for people?
It's confusing, I think, for a lot of reasons. So I think the first thing we have to understand is that histamine is a communication molecule, and it is communicating a lot throughout the body, and it's communicating really, really important physiological functions. So this is all good, right? We need histamine. It's really, really important. But sometimes we have too much of it. And when that happens, it can show up anywhere in the body. So histamine, like literally every cell in our body has histamine receptors. And that means that histamine can bind to a cell and then have an impact or make that cell do something. And histamine impacts different parts of the body for different people, resulting in like literally pretty much any symptom that you could possibly think of has the potential to be histamine mediated. Doesn't mean it is, but the potential is there. So lots of different possible symptoms. And in addition to the histamine piece impacting different body parts, there are different reasons why people can have high histamine levels. And, if we were to look at sort of the classic medical model and what doctors are trained in with regards to histamine, they're taught that histamine is part of an allergic response. And so, they just kind of know that one little piece, but as I've mentioned, it can really impact any body part. So then there's all these triggers. And I think you've probably talked about triggers with different people on your show because they don't just impact histamine, they're really involved in all chronic health conditions. And so probably, one of the ones that I think is most impactful for people is stress, right? It's such a big trigger for all kinds of different health conditions, but definitely can cause a release of histamine in the body, and there's hormone imbalance. And this really, especially, I find impacts women going into puberty and also going into perimenopause. And that's not to say it doesn't impact men, but definitely we see those periods in women's lives being sort of a big shift for histamine. EMFs is another big trigger. Like there's all these different triggers. And then to add to the layers of confusion, I think we have to be really clear that there's two different conditions that involve histamine. And one of them is histamine intolerance, and the other one is MCAS, which is an acronym for mast cell activation syndrome. And I really feel that there is a lot of confusion between the two. I know functional medicine doctors are really well versed in MCAS, but I feel like other types of practitioners are not so much. And I really think that they're confusing the two, which I think again can be confusing. If somebody is told they have histamine intolerance, but they actually have mast cell activation syndrome, it just gets a lot more complicated with mast cell activation syndrome than it does with histamine intolerance. So there are there's so many reasons that it's confusing. And then just to like add another layer, sort of the icing on the cake, a lot of people go to their medical doctor and they'll be like, I've got X, Y, and Z, right? They're listing the symptoms that they have. And their doctor will run a full blood work panel. And that blood work will come back as normal. And then the doctor says, everything's fine, you're fine. But you're not fine. Like people know what they're experiencing in their own body. And so having that experience it's very dismissive. It's very invalidating to be told like what you're experiencing is not actually happening. And so then people are like, well, maybe it's all in my head. My doctors told me it's all in my head. My doctor said nothing is wrong. And so then there's this very complex, I think, sort of emotional confusion that happens because what you are experiencing and what you're being told are two completely different things. So that was a very long answer to your question.
It's great though, because when we lay it all out, it is confusing, but I think that anyone listening to this can understand, okay, yeah, this is why it's been tough to get all the pieces. And you've even mentioned professionals, even doctors may only have one piece of the puzzle, or their understanding may come from one angle. And this is pretty pervasive. It touches all cells of the body, potentially a lot of different potential triggers for causing it. And so, yeah, you can see why it can get confusing quickly. And as you're saying that, I also kind of realized, yeah, this is why I'm drawn to this topic a little bit, because having gone through my own chronic health issues, confusing health issues, unable to nail down what's going on, all kinds of crazy symptoms, it's like this topic really is covering that. So it extends, even if histamine intolerance isn't the issue a person has or the only issue. I think what we're going to cover here, how we can think about it, how a person can kind of narrow in and start to get some benefit, that can apply to a lot of what people are dealing with nowadays. And what we're just seeing more and more. I mean, you're not seeing as many, or let me say this differently. There's more and more people who are dealing with health issues that it's not just nicely categorized in a box. It's not just like, all right, here's your high cholesterol, here's your medication, or however someone wants to handle that. It's a bit messy, and it's not well understood. I think a lot of it, in my experience, stems from immune dysfunction, which sounds like there's a lot of immune activity going on with histamine intolerance that we can cover, and for sure in MCAS that you mentioned. So yeah, unfortunately, it is confusing, but I think it speaks to what a lot of people are going through, dealing with, trying to navigate maybe at different levels, different parts of that health journey, right? Because I remember back at the beginning when I started, I'm just like, I got these annoying symptoms. I need to go in, find out what's wrong with me, and get my pill, and I'll be on my way. And then years or decades later, people find out a lot of times that's not cutting it. So if we go back, you said something about a more conventional approach is often, it's considered an allergic response, which it seems like it is. So where does that fall short, and what are other ways people could think about it, and maybe that's more comprehensive and that might lead them to more relief sooner?
Yeah, that is a great question. So a classic allergic response is it's a mast cell response. And so the mast cells are responding to the allergen, whether you're allergic to pets or pollens or whatever, maybe a food you're allergic to. And the mast cells release histamine. And so that again is what most doctors understand about mast cells and histamine is this very classic allergic response. And so a lot of people who have histamine intolerance or mast cell activation syndrome have allergic types of symptoms. They may or they may not, but definitely we would expect to see some of those classic allergic types of symptoms. But with I'm going to talk a little bit more about mast cell activation syndrome because mast cells release histamine, as we know from an allergic response. But histamine is just one of 1,200 different chemicals that mast cells house. They are these, like, they're just an incredible immune cell. And they're really the master immune cell. They're regulating the rest of the immune system and they're communicating with the body. Like I think of them as masters of communication, masters of signaling. They are really, really brilliant at that. And their job is to be communicating with the rest of the body via these 1,200 different chemical mediators. So they'll send out different mediators to communicate different information to the body. And so I think that's part of where the complexity and the confusion also lies because these cells themselves are so incredibly complex. So, in addition to histamine, they can be releasing any of these 1,200 chemicals, resulting in, this incredible myriad collection of symptoms that, as I've mentioned, can literally be any symptom that you can possibly imagine. And so one way that I like to think of this is I use the analogy of a spider's web a lot. So if we think of our classic medical model, it's a very linear model, right? You go see your doctor, you say, I've got this symptom, or maybe this collection of symptoms. And then doctors are trained to use a collection of symptoms plus usually some biomarkers that they would do, through some kind of lab testing. And through the collection of symptoms plus the biomarkers, then they would make a diagnosis. But, and then you've got the diagnosis, and then maybe there's a pharmaceutical that they would give you. So that's that very linear model. But I feel like our health is like a spider's web. So, whatever symptoms you have, regardless of what they are, those represent the center of a spider's web. And we have so many different threads coming into the center of that web. And every one of those threads is a contributing factor. So, maybe there was toxic exposure to something. There's so many things that are toxic for us, whether it's, pesticides sprayed on foods, or maybe you've had silver amalgam dental fillings that have mercury in them. So there could be some toxicity, environmental toxins, glyphosate toxicity, heavy metal toxicity. Stress I've mentioned is a really big one. So that could be another thread coming in. Trauma could be another one. And like that is such a complex topic. And there's so many different forms that trauma can take. So maybe you've got some threads coming in that are trauma related. Maybe you've got threads coming in that are hormone related or exposure to EMFs or, like there's just so many emotional factors as well. So our health is really this whole collection of all of these threads coming in, and the symptoms are the center of the web. And then if you think of a web, there's always those connecting strands that connect all the threads, and everything is really interrelated. And so we can't just take one thread and say it's in no way connected to the other thread. So it's this very, very complex, intricate web that leads to the symptoms that we have. And again, this really applies to, I think, all chronic illness. But when we're looking at mast cell activation, definitely we see lots of different threads coming in for sure. And, the more we can use a healthcare model or a wellness model where we start to identify each of those threads and address how they're contributing and what we can do, what habits we can change, or lifestyle changes that we can make to change those threads coming in, we can start to see those symptoms shift. So I think it's a, well, hopefully it's a helpful visual for people to sort of understand a little bit more about their health.
Yeah, I like that analogy because it pictures it accounts for the complexity like you're talking about. It was a huge change for me, just a huge like paradigm shift to start to realize that there can be multiple contributing factors to your health. And I say that now, today's day and age, the current age, everyone will be like, well, duh, there's all kinds of influencers and social media about it. But growing up, just a conventional healthcare mindset, that was my only experience. I really was trained to have the idea of like, okay, there's one problem, there's one answer, or there's one symptom, there's one problem causing that. And it literally took 10 plus years, like over a decade of going all kinds of different doctors and specialists and getting opinions and trying this drug and that surgery and, on and on and on till finally went more into alternative options. Again, just looking for something that could provide a little relief, and eventually found some mentors and other practitioners that laid it out more the way you're talking about. It's like, oh, well, I'm searching for this one thing. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack. Actually, there's 10 things and probably even a lot more. But it was just a whole mindset shift to realize no one of these things does everything. That's why, from day to day life, I do get exposure to toxins or have some EMFs, or, don't eat the cleanest food. And it's not like I'm dying, or maybe even tomorrow I don't feel that much different. And I had to really change the way I thought about it to realize this is a big accumulation over time. And when you think about it that way, there's really nothing in the conventional approach currently that accounts for that. Like you said, there's a big blood test, and the body's pretty powerful at keeping the blood balanced, and
Yes.
it'll make compensations elsewhere. So a lot of people do get that frustrating experience. Like, here's your normal blood work. Don't know what to tell you. Come back when you feel worse, and yet they're barely even functional. Like there was points where I'm like not functional, not living life anyway that I'd like to, and I can't sit around and wait for the blood test to get worse. I did have markers that were off, but it still was, addressing just those markers was never gonna fix the whole picture. So yeah, I think it's really important. I think it's the way, like what way you've laid it out, it is very helpful, and it just shows how rooted we are in that older paradigm that I mentioned. Because people will hear this, like, yeah, it makes sense, but why am I so confused about all my symptoms and frustrated about my condition? And it's also, I'll be honest, it's kind of difficult to find good practitioners who can understand this, who can handle the complexity, but also drill it down to make it manageable. So how do you like to help the people you work with narrow down and focus on whatever, let's say, the strands of the spider web that are going to be most impactful for them?
Yeah. So I think when we're talking about histamine specifically, and I can generalize this a little bit too, but um, I think diet is just so fundamental. The food we put into our bodies, it okay, so I'm going to backtrack here a little bit. I talked about how mast cells are these incredible cells that are communicating all the time with our body. Food is also communicating with our body all the time. It contains all of this incredible information. So every mouthful of food you put into your body is going to communicate information. Now, when we're talking specifically about histamine, there are foods that are high in histamine and that are definitely problematic for people who have either histamine intolerance or mast cell activation syndrome. And it's problematic from slightly different perspectives. So if you have histamine intolerance, it means that your body is not able to metabolize histamine well. It can't break it down and clear it out. So you tend to accumulate histamine in the body. So if you can reduce histamine from the foods that you're eating, that's one way to manage that. If you have mast cell activation syndrome, it's possible that your mast cells are sensitized to histamine. So when you eat it from foods, it's one of the triggers that triggers a mast cell response, and that's certainly the case for me and for many of the people that I work with. So I think diet is always a really really good place to start. And so again, if you're having histamine or mast cell issues, doing a low histamine diet is a great place to start. And I think Luca covered that pretty comprehensively. But I'll just review some of the like big hitters. So anything fermented is going to be high in histamine, and this is like for many of us who've been on this journey. um, one of the first things I did when I started changing my diet was going gut healthy. So, from a dietary perspective, that means making sure you've got good quality animal proteins to like repair the intestinal lining. So, bone broth is often talked about a lot. It also means, getting all of these fermented foods into your diet for the probiotics that they provide. So, those are also incredibly high in histamine. So when I started doing this whole gut healthy approach, I actually developed new symptoms. And so that was kind of, well, I say it was a light bulb moment for me, but that moment, it took me a year to figure that out because nobody was talking about histamine. And, when you were talking earlier about like having all of these different symptoms, and it's interesting when people have histamine or mast cell mediated symptoms because often you do have this whole collection of symptoms. And to finally understand that, like, this one thing is actually connecting them all. And that's not always the case, but often we see for people who have histamine intolerance or mast cell activation syndrome, it's just the one thing, right? You just go, oh, like this is all histamine mediated. All of these symptoms I'm having, even though some of them are skin related and some of them are, my nose is always drippy. And for women, maybe they've got period pain, right? Like it can seem very disconnected. But anyway, so I'm sort of digressing here. But yeah, I think diet is always a really, really good place to start. Um, and with diet, going as clean as you can, so as much organic as you can afford. I think that's really important. Again, if you suspect histamine or mast cell issues, I think going low histamine is really important. So, like fermented foods, bone broth, as I've said, some of the healthy foods that people might be consuming that they think are really good for them would be things like tomatoes and spinach and citrus fruits and banana and avocado, right? Those are talked about a lot in the health and wellness realm, but they are high histamine. So they're not going to be great for everybody.
Okay, right. So that makes sense that foods are putting in our bodies every day, 3 times a day, maybe more for some people, can be introducing more histamine to an already overloaded system and just causing problems. Are there any figures about what percentage of people with histamine or MCAS where it's more in the realm of a histamine overload where they're just not clearing it well versus more of the MCAS realm that you described where the immune system's almost kind of going haywire and then it interprets this additional histamine as the need to attack invaders or really have a full-blown immune
Yeah.
response. And I ask that because it seems like some people can take an enzyme and get relief. It's like, oh, this enzyme's helping me clear the histamine and now I feel a lot better. And then there's other people over here, some very sensitive MCAS individuals who are like, that doesn't even move the needle at all. And that's just, again, classic chronic health issue where one person takes a B vitamin, one person takes magnesium, XYZ. There's all these different solutions where it's the final step for somebody that tips them over, at least into like a little bit of relief. I don't think a lot of times that thing's always permanent or very strong foundation. But for someone who's been suffering, just a little reprieve is like a godsend. So is there, do you have any sense, or if there's no numbers about it, maybe you could just talk about your own experience and your groups or your business,
Yeah.
how many people fall in those categories? Because I think that then impacts what kind of benefit people are going to get from interventions and where they might want to start to try and get relief.
Yes. Yeah. So the numbers vary pretty drastically, as low as like for histamine intolerance, 1% of the population. We have a study out of Germany that, so this is the German population showing that 17% of the population has MCAS. And it's estimated that in the United States that it's 20% of people who are struggling with MCAS. And that is a huge, huge number. So if you can imagine yourself sitting down to dinner or drinks with, 5 or 6 friends, one person at that table is going to have MCAS. And it's such a big number, I think, largely because what we have done to our world, right? So as humans, we have, I've talked about toxicity. We've created a lot of toxicity in our world. As humans, we have created societies that are so success driven. And, whether that's corporate success or, um, I'm a parent. So I think of like keeping up with the Joneses, with your kids, like how many activities do I have my kids in? If we look at parenting, through the different stages, right? Kids are going into university. So parents are like prepping them, with like, you've got to have volunteer experience and you've got to be on a team and you've got to, do this and that. So we've created this world that has a lot of toxicity, EMF exposure. We're really changing the nature of these different magnetic fields. We've always been exposed to magnetic fields. Our planet is full of them, but nature's magnetic fields and the ones we've created through all of our digital devices, is very, very different. So I think we 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 really have to like step back and simplify um, our life in many ways. And I think MCAS, I don't know if you've heard of the term, it's used for different health conditions, but the canary in the coal mine, where like the canary used to be put down into the coal mine because the canary would, if there were gases in the environment, the canary would drop over dead. And that was the warning for the coal miners, right? Like there's gas here, it's dangerous, we need to get out of the mine. But MCAS is really, I think, the people with MCAS, and this is myself as well, we're those canaries, right? We're our immune systems are saying like our environment is not safe. And so I know Luca talked a lot about safety, and it is just such a big part. How do we create safety in the body? And I think it really comes back to really, really simplifying life. We like, do you need to climb that corporate ladder, or can you just step back and do something different that makes your life simpler? Can you go to a more simple diet the way our grandparents or great grandparents ate, which was just clean and simple? It doesn't have to be complicated. So the numbers are really staggering when we hear like 17% or 20%. Those are huge, huge numbers. And, Luca and I are now at the points where, for both of us, where we're almost exclusively working with people who have histamine or mast cell issues. So we're kind of seeing that percentage of the population specifically. But it's all of these people who, one of the things that Luke and I often talk about is people who have, especially mast cell issues, they persevere and they keep looking for answers. And we're always so glad that they find their way to us and the resources that we offer. Because when you've been dismissed by your doctors, but you know what you're feeling, right? You keep searching. And I feel like this group of people, they just keep persevering because they know something's wrong. And they also inherently understand that their body has this ability to heal itself. So they're looking for those answers, and they're looking for, really outside of conventional medicine because they've been let down by that system. So, anyways, the numbers are really quite staggering.
And if someone like that is listening to this podcast right now, been searching for answers, but not giving up and just committed to figuring out what's going on, you've laid out kind of the broad picture of what's going on, and we've acknowledged like this is why it's confusing, this is why it's stressful for people to try and sort out. Is there one single thing that you would hope that person could understand, or what do you think is most important for that person to understand to smooth out their health journey a little bit and keep using that dogged determination, but sooner rather than later get to the better health that they're seeking?
Yeah, I think what people need to understand is that there is so much they can do themselves. There's so much that they can take into their own hands. They don't need, right? If we go back to that traditional medical model, the doctor was God, right? The doctor told you what to do and you did it. And I think we have to understand that we have this incredible power to advocate for ourselves and to empower ourselves, and that this ability to reclaim our wellness is very much within our own reach. I'm not going to say entirely within our own reach, because I do think the doctors who understand these conditions have a lot to offer. There's not a lot of them that do understand it, but those that do have a lot to offer. And I think, like, again, I mentioned trauma is one of those threads coming into the spider's web. Could be, doesn't mean it is. But getting the specialist, whether you have a psychologist, or some kind of mental health practitioner that is working with you, or if you have lots of toxicity, sometimes the only way to know that is through testing, right? So finding a practitioner who can help with that. So I think it is really important to take things into your own hands, do everything you can yourself. And there's a lot. And, Luke and I, we founded Histamine Haven. We wrote the book. The book and our online program are really, really designed to allow people to explore all of the potential triggers, all of the steps that they can do themselves. And once they've explored all of that, then we sort of guide people through, if you've done all of this and you still have, maybe you've got this collection of symptoms over here, then you might want to consider doing this. Or maybe your symptoms look more like this, then you might want to consider, doing this. So Luke and I have been through this whole journey ourselves, right? We've been through exactly what you described. Like, I've been to the doctors, I got the medication for the one symptom, but as soon as I stopped, everything came back. So I think it's really, really important to me, and I think to Luca as well, that we're able to make a difference in people's lives and give them the tools that they need to navigate a lot of this. So there is so much. I really want people to understand that there is so much that they can do on their own.
Yeah. So past experience has told me that people are almost craving to do more. So you mentioned the diet is a starting point, and I'll link to Luca's episode because she did cover ways they could start. Say someone feels like they've addressed their diet. You've mentioned trauma or looking at an emotional component a couple times. Is that the next best, or let's say one of the top 3 that someone could investigate, or what else are some specifics?
I would say, aside from diet, probably the most important thing you can do is manage stress. And I say manage stress instead of reducing stress, because I think a lot of people feel like the stressful situations are the things that they don't have control of. And so, maybe stuff is happening at work and you don't have a lot of control over that, and that brings you stress. Or maybe something happens with your family, it wasn't expected. That can bring a lot of stress. So I think having tools to create calm in your life that's like probably the next really important step. And there's, again, like Luke and I talk people through a lot of different options in our online program. But, meditation can be great. I know meditation doesn't resonate with everybody, but finding something that brings you calm, whether that's, a certain kind of music that you like to listen to. And then the really important thing is, because, you might say, okay, yeah, I'm going to meditate, but you have to make it a daily practice. And, just like with the diet, it has to be a daily ongoing practice. Whatever you choose as your stress management tool, it has to become habit and part of your everyday routine. So I think that's probably the next most important step.
Okay. Yeah, and as you say that, it's just another example of why I could see this being challenging for people because, yeah, meditation might resonate for some, but not for others. So now we're back at the scenario of like everybody's individual. What's going to work for one person won't work for another necessarily, or maybe they just won't even be interested in it. So not only, with stress, not only is managing stress part of it, but then finding the solution that works, trying it, starting it, and just navigating through that till you find what works for you as an individual. That just adds another layer. And we're just talking about stress right here. Not there's I know there's other layers. To go back to your spider web analogy, there's going to be other strands coming in. And yeah, I get it. I mean, going back to the canary in the coal mine, that my dentist called me that. Eventually I was having like all these teeth pains, like receding gums, just problem after problem, not all oral health, but I was asking him these questions. He's like, you're kind of like a canary in the coal mine. You're really sensitive. Like, these things are issues we're going to handle. Some of these other things, I just need to let them go. And he was right. But also, when your body is in a total state of disarray, when there's virtual war going on inside with the immune system, then kind of everything out there, you do become more sensitive to it, or more, your immune system reacts to it. And I was definitely going through that. So then to find like a stress management tool, like I at times in my life really enjoyed meditation for a number of years, and then probably at my most sensitive, most difficult times, that I was like, I don't even know how I ever did that. Like, how am I going to sit still and quiet the mind and not just feel, overarching pain that pulls me out of it in 5 minutes. So I would say even throughout a person's lifetime, like the solutions are gonna change. Do you find that that's why it's important to work with a practitioner so they can give you a few different options? Do people do it in groups in your program? Does that help people kind of see how others are getting through it? What other kind of things can help people find it?
Yeah, we've got a like group coaching right now, which is sort of a big group coaching, and are hoping soon in the future to have small group coaching as well. But yeah, we are not static beings. We're changing and evolving, and different factors, different triggers are going to come into our lives. So yeah, I think we have to like ebb and flow with things. Um, I think just walking outside is like one of the simplest things that people can do. If you have an urban park nearby, just go walk through that park. If you're able to take your shoes off and get them on the grass, connect yourself to the earth somehow. And some people are like, I don't know, it's not safe to walk barefoot, right? There's concerns. But even if you can sit on a bench somewhere and get your feet on the ground, sunlight exposure is just so beneficial. And interestingly, histamine is tied into our circadian rhythms. And, getting early sunlight exposure is a really powerful way to like reset your circadian rhythm. So I think if people, are looking for probably the simplest thing to do that doesn't involve, right? Like meditation, you kind of have to learn how to do that and practice it. But do just go for a walk, if nothing else, in a little park near you. If you've got a backyard, just go sit out in the backyard with a cup of tea. But yeah, things are always changing, so we have to kind of just shift with that. And yes, everybody, I'll give you a really good example. Journaling is often talked about as a great stress management tool. But for me, journaling, the idea of like rehashing something, that difficult that I went through the day, like I just don't want to go there. So for me, journaling is just like a big fat no in terms of, a stress management strategy. Other people love it because it gives them a chance to kind of think through their emotional state, how they felt about, maybe some of the symptoms they were experiencing, to reflect on what worked and what didn't work that day. So yeah, it's so individualized.
Yeah. And I mean, on that note, so you mentioned that someone could start with diet. Then you've mentioned that stress management in some way or another is an important piece. You mentioned a lot of toxins that people are exposed to. So if that's the case for someone at some point, they're going to want to do something to shed those from the body. Does order matter with these, or is it most important just get started and then add the next one as a person as you can?
Yeah, I think diet and stress management are important ones to start with. And if histamine is part of your picture, you will start to notice some kind of change. If it's histamine intolerance, you'll probably notice a big change. If it's mast cell activation syndrome, it might be a subtle change, but then at least you're on the right path. And so, hopefully with diet, your symptoms are going to improve a little bit. Um, yeah. So, and then the rest of it, I feel, is a very, very personal journey. Sometimes people just aren't ready to explore certain things. Like, I'll give you a really, really good example and one that can be very, very costly for people, and that is mold exposure and remediation, right? So, mold can be a huge trigger for some people. For some people, it doesn't impact their health at all. But I have clients who have just been like knocked flat, like can't function, can't get out of bed. Um, and I used to live like this was decades ago, but I lived in a moldy apartment and I was very, very sick at the time. And that one is like, I just see people who are like, I can't leave my home. I have nowhere else to go. I can't afford a new place. The rentals aren't available. Like there can be some really, really big obstacles to that one. So, sometimes we just have to say, okay, we're going to just have to address other things, even though often mold, until you address mold, you're not going to see significant improvements in other areas. So, yeah, it's just, you kind of have to just say, like, okay, this is a person's life. What avenues are we able to explore at this time? And, what can we put on the back burner for now? And so that just looks really, really different from person to person. And it becomes a very unique journey.
Yeah, yeah. That's a great point though about the mold. I mean, that's been part of my health picture as well. Probably a bigger part, but I never knew until way down the line, like I said, after decades and finally got around practitioners and doctors who are a little more aware of that possibility. And then, testing numbers are off the charts and we're like, okay. And I remember moving twice in 6 months. And then the last time, getting a ERMI back off the charts. And my practitioner's like, look, I know it's tough. I'm sorry, but you really need to move out of that place that you're currently in, or just what you said, like we're not going to be able to really make progress. Well, you can keep trying to maintain, basically tread water, keep your head above water. But with that level of exposure where your health is right now, your body's just not going to be able to recover. And it's like the most defeating thing. So you're like, I've been trying so hard doing all these other things, and I don't know if I have the energy to do that
Yeah.
again.
Yeah.
And I know just from my own experience going through, it's like, we went back and forth several times, like first accepting that mold's a potential factor and then being like, well, is it really as big a deal as these, practitioners or social media people are making it? Then, having worse health problems and being like, okay, yeah, this is legit. I need to pay attention. And just kind of as I zigzagged my way through to like a deeper understanding of how mold can really impact and how it's fairly common. It's not an uncommon thing to be in buildings, work, school, apartments, things like that.
Yeah.
That I do find it's a little tough to wrap your mind around, especially again for people are struggling with health issues and have brain fog and limited energy. That just adds on top. So what do you find anything helps people wrap their mind around that and understand how much their health can improve if they are able to find a good place? And then any tips you have that you guys use as you help people or educate people about this?
Yeah. So, that's one that I have to say that I actually really struggle with as a practitioner, because what I want to say is get out of your home. And, I like that's not the first thing I could really come out with, because I'm a nutrition practitioner. So people are coming to me for food, help with their diet. So to have people just aren't expecting me to have like a mold conversation with them. And so it's really, really challenging. Unfortunately, well, I think I have a variety of responses with my clients, but unfortunately, I have seen several times where my clients just keep getting sicker. And, so we'll sort of start with the conversation like, do you have somebody you could go stay with? And, I'll be honest, a lot of my clients are just like, I don't, right? Like, families may be passed on, or they live in a place where, real estate is at a real prime. So people don't have extra space where they can stay. And so I have watched some of my clients just like on a steady decline until, you know, it's like, okay, like Tracy said, I had to get out. I guess I finally have to do this. And it's it's really, really hard, um, as a practitioner. Sometimes I just have to like we have to talk through a variety of scenarios and say, okay, well, if you stay here, what's going to happen? And sometimes and I'll even like make up a chart for them, right? So that they can see all these different scenarios. And the reality is, if mold is impacting you and you're going to stay in a moldy home, um, chances are that you're not going to make a lot of progress, or you're going to get much, much worse. And it's, yeah, it's very hard as a nutrition practitioner. I think maybe some other practitioners are able to approach it maybe a little bit more directly, but it's such a difficult one. And it's, sometimes the mold's not visible. And like I can almost always identify somebody who's exposed to mold because they're so sick and they are so sensitized, right? They're sensitive to everything. They're sensitive to movement. They're sensitive to light. They're sensitive to smells. They've got literally a handful of foods that they're tolerating. Like you just learn to identify these people pretty quickly. And again, like if that mold's not visible, it can be really, really challenging to try to convince somebody that, you need to go do the Hermy testing, right? Like get some of these numbers. And of course, these tests are all expensive as well. So financial barriers can be a very big reality for some people as well.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. I remember it all, and at the and where I got to is eventually it's like, well, the financial reality of staying sick, not being able to work full time, not being able to, pursue my career and dreams with my full, passion and mind and inspiration. I'm like, that is pretty expensive too. But yeah, there's no simple easy option. That's
No,
for sure.
no.
And on the positive side, I'll say earlier on in my practice, I was like aware of this, but also it was a little bit outside my comfort level. So I would present it to clients, but not, I didn't have the tools really to help them through it at that time. But the people who moved would come back 3, 6 months, start following the program, they would just skyrocket, and I'm like, there's no supplement, there's no intervention. Everyone's like, what's the one thing that'll change everything? And there really isn't. It's more of a stack of habits, like we talked about, multiple things, but very few things changed people's health as quickly and positively as the clients who did take that to heart and ended up moving. I'm like, how you doing? Like, oh, I feel great. Can finally sleep again. Sensitivity's down. All this stuff.
Yeah.
Like, what'd you do? They're like, nothing really. And then 10 minutes in the conversation, like, well, I did move. And that really drove it home for me to see it in other people too. That,
Mm-hmm,
yeah,
mm-hmm.
this is a big leverage point. EMFs I find is another one like that, where it's almost hard to believe. Like, could this really be that big of issue? And I think for, just like you said, for mold, like some people aren't really affected, or at least outwardly and obviously. I do think it's a stressor. To what extent, we have all kinds of stressors, people can handle them and not have an issue, but there is an effect. But whether it's severe or not, I think there's even a smaller portion of the population where it's like severe and major, a major issue. But I've had a couple building biologists come to homes and at different times in my life, and to see their testing and some of the uh, electromagnetic charges they pick up, like that stuff's there. So if you are sensitive, or let's say, you have mold, histamine, other stressors to your health, and that's just can be the cherry on top. And
Yes.
but I mention it because it's another one that's it's invisible. You don't see those frequencies,
Yeah.
but some people really do get bogged down with them.
And it's such a pervasive part of our lifestyle now, right? Like, to tell somebody, you need to cut down on your screen time, whether that's computer, phone, whatever. Like, we literally, like, oh, okay, I'm going to tell a little story here, but my parents are aging right now and declining. And my brother and I have just been through the process of moving them into a care facility. And the amount of stuff we have to do for them now, because they never embrace technology. But you can't live today without having a phone. Like, the apps that are required to carry out so many daily functions, right? Park in this parking lot, or, access whatever you need to access, right? Whether it be a boarding pass, to the airport, or a ticket to an event. Like, we can't, increasingly, it becomes more and more difficult to live without technology. And so we have to, I think, on some level, accept that EMFs are part of our life, but then also recognize, like, how do I detox myself from these, right? How do I, like, I've got a blue light blocker on my computer screen, right? So, like, you look really yellow right now. But, what are these interventions that we do to minimize the impacts of some of these things?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a great point. Like it's just a different world, so we can't live the same way my grandparents did, So and that's another example. Like I had a grandparent who ate whatever they wanted, and see, didn't age great, but people could get away with that then.
Yeah.
Now, an analogy to that, to poor diet, or less clean eating, would be the tech you're talking about. It's part of the world. Yeah, we're definitely. I don't want to go without it either. But I think the key message is that, okay, that's going to add a little drag on your health in some ways. So then we got to do something corresponding to help lift it up. And so
Yeah.
just living how humans did for many, many generations might not cut it, because we have all these new things, new introductions, a lot of new, like, chemicals and more pervasive toxins, things like that too. It's like we can live, but you definitely have to do things to balance it out. And it probably is going to be different than what your grandparents did, for sure, maybe even your parents.
Yes. Yeah. We have to really be preventative about a lot of things. And I love how you use the word balance, because it's, like you said, like, if we're exposed to EMFs, what do we do to counterbalance that? If we're exposed to toxins, and we are, right? We're breathing in polluted air, there's pollutants in our water. What do we do to counterbalance that? And so we just have to be much more cognizant of these things in today's world.
Yeah. Yeah. Agreed. Tracey, if people want to work with you or follow more of your work, how can they do that?
So, Luca and I have created Histamine Haven. And so you can find that at histaminehaven.com. We have, every month, we do a free webinar that discusses the histamine connection to symptoms. So that is a great place to start. You can sign up for our blog or newsletter, or as well on our homepage. There's a few different resources you can access. And then for people who are ready to kind of jump into the whole, like, explore everything that they need to do, explore the spider's web, as it were, we have an online program that they can do at their own pace, and then join us for the group coaching sessions there.
Great. Well, we will link to those in the description. Tracey, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.